Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the quirky, occasionally bizarre, yet strangely comforting world of ancient Egyptian laws. Imagine you're wandering the dusty streets of a kingdom where the laws are as old as the pyramids themselves. You might think that a place known for its monumental achievements, grand temples, and mysterious pyramids would have laws that just deal with the basics: theft, murder, and the occasional papyrus dispute. But no, ancient Egypt had rules that were as fascinating as the Nile itself, full of nuances and oddities you might not expect. You probably won't survive the ordeal of trying to get around in Egypt back then, considering how harsh some of these laws were. You might find yourself getting a bit too close to a cat or a crocodile, and, well, things could get weird. But for now, let's ease into it together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, feel free to share your location and the time there in the comments below. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Egyptian law wasn't something you could just ignore. It governed everything from trade to the way you dressed. The system of laws was intricately woven into the very fabric of Egyptian life, and it was deeply tied to the country's religion, politics, and even the cycles of the Nile. You see, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was a living god on earth. His word was law, and it wasn't just about punishing bad behavior. It was about restoring cosmic order, something that Egyptians believed was vital for keeping their civilization from falling apart. Let's begin with the most important figure in the legal system, the pharaoh. The pharaoh wasn't merely a figurehead like a modern-day president or king. No, the pharaoh was considered the embodiment of divine law. In their eyes, the pharaoh wasn't just someone who ruled over Egypt. They were the earthly representative of the gods themselves, particularly Horus and Osiris. So, when the pharaoh made a decision, it wasn't just political, it was divine. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh's judicial powers were absolute or whether they were tempered by a council of priests and noblemen, but one thing is certain: their decisions were final. If you had a problem with your neighbor, your property rights, or even a family dispute, you could bring it directly to the pharaoh or his appointed judges. If you were fortunate, your issue might be resolved quickly. If you were unfortunate, you could end up with a punishment that would make modern penalties look tame in comparison. Speaking of punishments, let's talk about the rather creative ways that ancient Egypt handled crime and wrongdoing. While today our criminal justice system tends to focus on rehabilitation, ancient Egypt was all about deterrence. Their legal system was brutal, and the punishments often reflected the severity of the crime. But here's the kicker: they didn't always punish crimes in the way you might think. Yes, there were public beatings and executions for more severe offenses, but there were also oddities that make modern legal systems seem a lot less interesting. For instance, there's evidence that Egypt had laws governing, of all things, the treatment of animals. Imagine this: if your dog was caught killing someone's cat, it wasn't just the dog that would face punishment, it was the owner. And if your cat was found guilty of a crime, yes, cats were actually considered sacred, the penalties could include fines, religious sacrifices, and sometimes exile. The idea of divine justice and order extended beyond just the pharaoh's decisions. Laws were made to uphold cosmic balance, called Mut. This was the idea that the universe ran on an eternal order that needed to be maintained by the pharaoh's wisdom and the legal system's fair application. The concept of Mut was not just a philosophy, it was the very foundation of Egypt's society. It was up to the pharaoh to make sure that order prevailed, even if it meant some rather peculiar laws that governed daily life. For example, Egypt had laws governing the Nile's flooding. If you lived near the riverbanks, you'd better be on your best behavior. When the floodwaters rose, they could damage crops and property. As a result, the pharaoh had to make sure that those who lived near the river were law-abiding, to prevent chaos when the flood season came. Imagine that: laws written to ensure that people didn't get too carried away by nature's unpredictability. Egyptian law was also very particular about how people behaved in public spaces. For example, anyone caught showing disrespect to a superior or a deity could face severe punishment. Public shaming, fines, or even imprisonment could result from these small infractions. Imagine having to bow in front of a statue just to keep the local priest from reporting you. It might sound silly, but these rules were as serious as any modern legal code. But here's where things get even stranger: labor laws. The labor force in ancient Egypt wasn't just made up of slaves. Egypt's pyramid builders and workers were often not slaves at all, but rather conscripted laborers. Many were farmers who worked for part of the year and then had to serve in the royal workforce. However, there were strict legal protections for these workers. They had to be provided with food, water, and shelter, and if a foreman mistreated them, they could face serious legal consequences. Imagine a labor union back then, a bit different than modern systems, but still a system in place to protect the worker. Historians often debate how fair these labor laws really were. Some believe the workers had decent conditions, while others argue that conditions were grim and the labor was far from voluntary. Regardless of the exact details, there were laws that ensured workers had basic rights, which is pretty surprising considering Egypt's ancient history. It wasn't just about the workers, though. The laws extended to daily life in all sorts of strange and quirky ways. For instance, you might be surprised to learn that in some cases, your own property was subject to the whims of the legal system. Let's say you died and left behind a house, cattle, or some other asset. In some cases, it wasn't just your family members who could lay claim to those assets. The pharaoh himself might take ownership, especially if there were no heirs or if the deceased was accused of wrongdoings. The importance of the Nile in ancient Egypt can't be overstated. It wasn't just a river, it was the lifeblood of the entire civilization. It provided water, transportation, and fertile soil for agriculture, making it central to Egypt's economy and culture. But interestingly, the Nile had its own set of laws attached to it, which might seem a little out there by today's standards. The flood cycle of the Nile, rising and falling every year, was so predictable and so crucial to the agricultural success of Egypt that the pharaohs actually based legal decisions around it. The flooding brought rich silt to the soil, making it possible to grow crops, but it also posed a risk to the livelihoods of those living along the banks. Too little water would lead to famine. Too much could result in devastating floods that destroyed homes and fields. This created an interesting dynamic when it came to governing and distributing resources. There were laws in place to prevent people from taking advantage of the floodwaters. For example, some property boundaries could be washed away during floods, leading to disputes over land ownership. To prevent this from escalating into full-blown chaos, a highly organized system of land surveying was established to reset boundaries after each flood. The role of the royal surveyor was critical, and there were even legal penalties for tampering with boundary markers. It wasn't just about land. If a person's crops were destroyed or damaged by the flood, they had to make a claim through a legal process that was heavily regulated by the state. You couldn't just waltz in and demand compensation. There was a whole bureaucratic system in place to ensure that your complaint was legitimate. This might sound like a bit of a headache, but it also highlights how seriously Egypt took the management of resources. They had entire legal systems designed to handle environmental disasters, something that would make modern-day disaster relief look a lot less organized. Historians still debate the fairness of these laws. On one hand, they show a remarkable level of foresight, anticipating the effects of the floods on daily life and providing ways for people to secure justice. On the other hand, some argue that the laws were more about maintaining the pharaoh's control over the agricultural economy than about providing real protection for the common people. If you were living along the Nile and got swept away in a flood, your property would likely be re-evaluated by the state. This would also involve a review of your debts, as the legal system was quite strict about people paying off what they owed. You could lose your land if you couldn't repay a debt, which ties into one of the quirkier laws of ancient Egypt, debt slavery. While Egypt didn't have the same kind of systemic slavery we think of in the modern context, debtors were often forced into labor to pay off their debts. But even then, there were protections in place. If a person was put into labor, they couldn't be treated as a mere slave and had legal rights. Another example of the legal system trying to maintain order while still offering a modicum of fairness. But let's dig into some of the more unique legalities surrounding the floodwaters, because Egypt had some bizarre rules. The most famous of these laws was perhaps the concept of the Royal Nile priesthood, which kept track of the floodwaters and made predictions about the coming year's agricultural prospects. These priests were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, and they played a key role in deciding what actions the pharaoh would take in the wake of flooding. If the water levels were lower than expected, these priests might advise the pharaoh to send extra aid to the affected areas. However, if the floods were excessively high, they might recommend harsher measures to redistribute resources to prevent widespread chaos. This intertwining of religion and law wasn't limited to just the Nile and the floods, it extended to nearly every aspect of life. The priests had a say in legal matters ranging from property disputes to criminal cases. There's evidence to suggest that a priestly class of lawyers emerged, but instead of attending law school, they likely trained at temples, where their primary role was to interpret the will of the gods as it applied to human matters. Imagine a society where your fate could rest on the interpretation of a divine decree. This was how Egypt functioned for centuries. Historians still argue about how much power these priests had in legal matters. Some believe that the priests were a significant check on the pharaoh's absolute power, while others argue that the pharaoh used the priesthood to maintain his hold on the legal system. Either way, their influence cannot be overstated. It's a fascinating mixture of theocratic rule and legal enforcement, where the gods themselves were believed to have a hand in deciding everything from land ownership to marriage rights. As you settle in, try to picture this. The ancient Egyptians didn't just go about their lives and hope the Nile was kind to them. They had an entire infrastructure dedicated to regulating the effects of the river, and they made sure that their legal system was just as fluid as the water that governed it. From agricultural regulations to land disputes and even divine intervention, the laws of Egypt ensured that everything stayed balanced. And as strange as it might sound, this system worked for thousands of years, helping Egypt to thrive as one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. The intersection of the Nile's flooding and Egypt's legal structure shows just how interconnected everything was. In ancient Egypt, you couldn't separate religion, law, and nature. They were all intertwined, creating a legal framework that was as vast and deep as the river that sustained them. These laws might seem unusual by modern standards, but they were effective in maintaining a sense of order in an ancient world filled with unpredictable natural forces. The labor laws of ancient Egypt are a fascinating aspect of their legal system, particularly when we think about one of the most iconic and labor-intensive projects in history, the construction of the pyramids. Building these monumental structures required a massive workforce, but contrary to what many people believe, the workers who built the pyramids weren't slaves. They were often skilled laborers and farmers who were conscripted to work during the off-season. Imagine being a farmer, minding your own business during the flood season when the Nile has overtaken your fields. The pharaoh needs you. You don't get to say, no. Instead, you're forced into the royal workforce. But this wasn't as grim as it sounds. In fact, many workers were relatively well treated compared to other forms of forced labor. They were fed, housed, and provided with medical care while they worked on these massive projects. In return, they could expect certain legal protections. For example, the state provided food and drink, which was a necessity considering how intense the labor was. Imagine working for hours under the hot Egyptian sun, picking up massive stones and arranging them with precision. But you couldn't work on an empty stomach. These workers were compensated, albeit in a different way than we might expect today. The pharaoh made sure they had enough sustenance to continue working, and this was a legal obligation. There were laws that guaranteed workers their rations, something that ensured the labor force would remain strong enough to finish the massive projects. The relationship between the laborers and the pharaoh was an interesting one, full of tension and respect. While it might seem like the laborers were at the mercy of the pharaoh's whims, they actually had some leverage. Workers had the legal right to petition for better conditions if their needs weren't being met. This petitioning process wasn't always effective, but it was available. There are records of workers going on strike to protest their conditions, something that might surprise modern-day observers. Imagine that, ancient Egyptians organizing work stoppages over issues like food shortages or dangerous working conditions. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these strikes, with some arguing that they were more of a formality, while others believe they were vital for improving conditions. This idea of labor rights in ancient Egypt isn't just limited to pyramid builders, it extended to other sectors of society as well. For example, workers who were involved in construction projects for temples and tombs had similar legal rights. These were not mere slaves, but individuals who could hold their bosses accountable. This might not seem like much by today's standards, but it was a huge step for a civilization that existed over 3,000 years ago. However, there was still an undercurrent of inequality. The laborers may have had certain legal protections, but their lives were still dictated by the demands of the pharaoh. If a worker couldn't fulfill their obligations, they could be punished. And punishment could be severe. But here's where it gets strange. Even if a worker was punished, the pharaoh had to ensure that the punishment was fair and just. Remember, the pharaoh's role wasn't just to rule, they were responsible for maintaining Ma'at, or cosmic order. If a worker was wrongfully punished, it could throw the entire system out of balance. It's a bit of a paradox. On one hand, the pharaoh had absolute power, but on the other, they had to ensure that the system they governed remained just. Historians argue whether these labor laws were truly fair or whether they were more about control. Some believe that the laborers had a relatively good deal, especially compared to what other ancient cultures imposed on their workers. Others suggest that, while the laborers had some protections, they were still largely at the mercy of the state. Either way, the legal system surrounding the labor force was a fascinating aspect of ancient Egyptian society, and it played a major role in building the empire's grand structures. Beyond the pyramid builders, ancient Egypt had an entire system of labor laws that governed other types of work. From artisans who created elaborate tombs to fishermen who relied on the Nile, the legal system made sure that all sectors of the economy were functioning smoothly. It wasn't just about protecting workers. It was about ensuring that Egypt's economy could thrive in a predictable, orderly manner. The pharaoh was the central figure in this, ensuring that each sector had the workers it needed to keep the kingdom running. And it wasn't just about the pharaoh's personal projects. Every aspect of life was considered, from the work of the farmers to the artisans who decorated temples. The legal system was designed to maintain order and ensure that no sector of the economy was neglected. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Egypt's labor laws had to do with what happened when a person died. Death and the afterlife were deeply entwined with legal matters in ancient Egypt. A person's property could be claimed by the state if they didn't have an heir, and it wasn't just material wealth that was passed on, it was also their legal rights and responsibilities. The laws surrounding death were complicated and full of nuance, and they were deeply connected to Egypt's religious beliefs. The ancient Egyptians believed in the concept of Ma'at, or divine justice, and this extended to death. When a person died, their soul was believed to travel through the underworld, where it would be judged by Osiris, the god of the afterlife. If they were found worthy, they would be granted eternal life. If not, they would be devoured by the monster Ammit, never to be heard from again. This belief in divine judgment extended to the legal system. If a person's debts weren't paid or if they had broken the law in life, their soul could be punished in the afterlife. It was a strange way of tying the living and the dead together, but it made sense in the context of Egypt's legal philosophy. After all, if the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of divine law, then the afterlife would be the ultimate judgment of that law. Historians still argue whether the laws surrounding death were purely religious or whether they had a practical, legal function. Some believe that the afterlife laws were simply a way to keep order in society, while others argue that they were deeply connected to religious beliefs and had a more spiritual function. Regardless of the true purpose, the way death was governed by law in ancient Egypt is a testament to how deeply law and religion were intertwined in this civilization. When you think about ancient Egypt, what probably comes to mind are their monumental achievements: the pyramids, the elaborate tombs of the pharaohs, the complex rituals of mummification. But the laws governing crime and punishment were just as interesting, and often just as elaborate. Egypt's legal system was designed not just to uphold order, but to protect the stability of society by ensuring that wrongdoers didn't upset the delicate balance of cosmic law, known as Ma'at. In ancient Egypt, crime wasn't simply about wrongdoing, it was an affront to the divine order. That's why the penalties for crimes could be severe, often far harsher than what we might expect today for similar offenses. But the severity of the punishment wasn't just to punish the wrongdoer, it was a way of restoring balance to the universe. Think of it as cosmic corrective justice. If someone broke the law, they weren't just being punished by the state, they were being punished by the gods, who were believed to be actively involved in ensuring that order prevailed. This may sound odd to us, but for the ancient Egyptians, it made perfect sense. There's no doubt that Egypt had some seriously harsh penalties for crimes. If you were caught stealing, for example, you could expect to lose a hand. This wasn't just a matter of personal retribution, it was about maintaining cosmic order. Punishment was meted out not just to punish the individual but to restore balance. However, it wasn't just the criminals who felt the effects of crime. Sometimes, even the victims had to answer for their role in it. If you were the victim of a crime, you might be called to testify in court, and your testimony could have serious consequences. If you were found to be lying or exaggerating, you could end up facing punishment yourself. It was a strange system, but one that reflected Egypt's deeply religious view of law. But it wasn't all about physical punishment. Some crimes were punished with exile. Exile was a particularly interesting form of punishment in ancient Egypt because it wasn't just about kicking someone out of the kingdom, it was about severing their connection to their community and the gods. The belief was that the gods resided in the land of Egypt, and being exiled meant you were cut off from divine favor. To be cast out was to be stripped of your identity as an Egyptian and your protection under the divine law. It was as much a spiritual punishment as a physical one. Now, here's the real kicker: not all crimes were punished with harsh penalties. Some offenses were considered minor, and the punishment could be more subtle, like fines or public shaming. Imagine being caught in a minor crime, say, insulting someone in public. In such cases, your reputation could be more damaged than any physical punishment. Public shaming in Egypt often meant being paraded through the streets with a sign around your neck that listed your crime. It wasn't just a way to punish you, it was a way to ensure that the public saw that justice was done. In this way, the legal system acted as a form of social control, where public opinion played an important role in keeping everyone in line. Historians still debate whether the ancient Egyptians practiced what we might consider rehabilitative justice. Most scholars agree that the primary goal of the legal system was to restore order and Ma'at, and this often involved harsh and immediate consequences for those who broke the law. But others argue that there may have been room for rehabilitation in certain cases, particularly for those who could prove they had learned their lesson or made reparations for their crimes. Unfortunately, the historical record doesn't give us a clear answer on this, but what's certain is that crime and punishment in ancient Egypt were deeply intertwined with religious and cultural practices. What's truly fascinating is that, even with the severity of some punishments, there was a legal framework in place that allowed for appeals and petitions. If you were wrongly accused of a crime, you could appeal directly to the pharaoh or to the royal judges, and in some cases, the pharaoh might intervene on your behalf. This suggests that there was at least some level of due process, which is quite advanced considering the time period. Imagine a world where, even in ancient times, the possibility of a legal appeal existed. The Egyptians understood that maintaining Ma'at wasn't just about enforcing harsh laws, it was about ensuring fairness and justice, at least on the surface. One of the most intriguing elements of Egyptian criminal law was the involvement of priests and religious figures in legal matters. Priests weren't just religious leaders, they were often the ones who decided legal cases. They had the power to interpret laws and, in some cases, issue punishments. It's hard to imagine in our modern system of law, where judges are separate from religious authority, but in ancient Egypt, the lines between religion and law were often blurred. If you had a legal issue, it was as much a matter of divine will as it was about human justice. Historians still wonder whether the priests were truly impartial in their rulings or whether they acted more as agents of the pharaoh's will. Some argue that the priests had too much power and that their judgments were often influenced by political factors. Others suggest that the priesthood was relatively fair and focused on maintaining balance. Regardless of where you stand on the debate, it's clear that the priests played an integral role in the administration of justice, and their involvement in legal matters speaks to the close connection between religion and law in ancient Egypt. The laws governing crime and punishment in ancient Egypt were harsh, but they also reflected the culture's belief in divine order. Whether you were punished with physical harm, exile, or social humiliation, it was all about restoring balance to the world and ensuring that the gods were satisfied with the way things were going. The Egyptians understood that law wasn't just a set of rules, it was a way of maintaining harmony with the universe. And that's something we can still appreciate even in our modern systems of justice. One of the most fascinating and often overlooked aspects of ancient Egyptian law is its treatment of women. When we think about ancient civilizations, we tend to assume that women were treated as second-class citizens with little or no rights. But in ancient Egypt, the situation was far more nuanced, and women had a surprisingly high level of legal autonomy compared to other ancient societies. Let's start with the basics. Egyptian women had the legal right to own property. Yes, that's right. They could inherit land, buildings, and even slaves. This might sound fairly ordinary by modern standards, but when you consider the times, this was extraordinary. In many other ancient civilizations, women were often considered the property of their husbands or fathers, with no ability to own anything of their own. Not so in Egypt. Women were free to engage in business, enter into contracts, and even manage estates independently. Of course, this doesn't mean women had absolute freedom. Like most societies of the time, the role of women in ancient Egypt was still primarily centered around the home and family. Women were expected to bear children and care for their families, but their legal rights were expansive enough that they could engage in commerce or even divorce their husbands if necessary. The concept of marriage in Egypt was more about partnership than ownership. In fact, one of the most interesting features of Egyptian marriage law was the relatively simple divorce process. If a woman wanted a divorce, she could simply declare it. This wasn't as dramatic as modern divorce proceedings, with lengthy battles over assets and custody. Instead, women could separate from their husbands with relative ease, and their property rights would remain intact. Historians still debate whether this legal freedom was the norm for all women in Egypt, or if it was more prevalent among the elite and wealthy. Some believe that women in the upper echelons of Egyptian society had more legal freedom than those in the lower classes, who might have had fewer opportunities to take advantage of the legal system. However, there are indications that even women in lower classes were not entirely oppressed by legal or social constraints. The fact that women could engage in trade, own property, and initiate divorce proceedings suggests a level of legal sophistication and autonomy that was rare in ancient times. But it wasn't just about property rights and divorce. Women in ancient Egypt also had legal protection in cases of physical abuse. If a woman was mistreated by her husband, she could bring the matter before a court, and the husband could be forced to compensate her or face punishment. This might not sound like much by today's standards, but the fact that women could seek legal recourse for domestic violence is remarkable for a civilization that existed thousands of years ago. Despite the legal protections in place, there were still limitations on women's roles in ancient Egyptian society. Women couldn't serve as pharaohs, with a few notable exceptions like Hatshepsut, and they were generally excluded from high-level political or military roles. However, they still had significant influence behind the scenes. High-ranking women often served as advisors to the pharaoh, wielding political power in a more subtle way. Cleopatra is perhaps the most famous example of a woman who defied the traditional roles and became one of Egypt's most powerful rulers, though her reign came much later than the period we're discussing. Still, for most of Egyptian history, women's primary role was seen through the lens of family and reproduction. But this doesn't mean their lives were dictated entirely by these constraints. Egyptian women had significant freedom of choice when it came to marriage and divorce, and their rights were enshrined in law. They could also engage in religious and social practices, including serving as priestesses in temples or acting as high-ranking officials in religious institutions. These roles weren't open to all women, but the fact that they existed shows that women could wield considerable influence within the framework of Egyptian society. In fact, the role of women in religious life was particularly interesting. Priestesses had a respected place in Egyptian society, and they often held positions of great power. Some of the most important temples in Egypt were dedicated to female deities, and the priestesses who served in these temples were considered to have a special connection to the gods. Priestesses could act as intermediaries between the gods and the people, making them highly influential figures in both the religious and legal spheres. The idea that women could have such an important role in Egyptian religion is yet another example of how Egyptian law and society were more progressive in terms of gender equality than many other ancient civilizations. But, of course, not everything was perfect. Despite the relatively progressive laws that women enjoyed, there were still strict social expectations. A woman's reputation was of utmost importance, and public moral conduct was considered essential. For instance, it was illegal for a woman to be seen as dishonorable or unvirtuous, which could result in punishment or social ostracism. Women were expected to maintain their purity, and this included everything from maintaining a chaste reputation to following the strict rules of conduct within marriage. Any deviation from these norms could result in punishment or public humiliation. Historians still debate how much of this was enforced by the state and how much was social pressure. It's clear that Egyptian society placed a great deal of importance on maintaining family structures and ensuring that women played their role in the home. However, the legal framework in Egypt provided women with the tools to challenge these norms if necessary. Whether through divorce, property rights, or protection from abuse, women in ancient Egypt had access to legal resources that allowed them to assert their independence and navigate their lives with some degree of agency. The role of women in ancient Egypt is often overlooked in discussions of ancient law, but it's one of the most fascinating aspects of the legal system. The combination of legal rights, social expectations, and religious influence created a unique and often complex environment where women could navigate their lives with more freedom and autonomy than many of their contemporaries. The laws of Egypt may not have been perfect, but they were certainly ahead of their time, especially when it came to women's rights. While ancient Egypt is often remembered for its grand monuments, pharaohs, and religious practices, there's another side of the kingdom that's equally fascinating: the laws governing slavery. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't as systematic or widespread as in other ancient cultures, but it did play a significant role in their society. The legal framework surrounding slavery in Egypt was complex, with a mix of social, economic, and legal factors that made the institution different from what we typically associate with slavery in the modern world. At first glance, it might seem like slavery in ancient Egypt was just as brutal and dehumanizing as in other ancient civilizations, but the reality was far more nuanced. For one thing, not all slaves were born into the condition of servitude. Some were captured during military conquests, while others were in debt or volunteered to enter servitude as a way of paying off debts. But it wasn't just about military conquests or debts. Egypt had a system of indentured servitude that was more akin to a contract than lifelong enslavement. This meant that some individuals who were not necessarily enslaved for life worked under the supervision of a master or the state for a specified period of time in exchange for food, shelter, and other provisions. Debt slavery in particular was common in Egypt. Much like the rest of the ancient world, if you couldn't repay a debt, You might find yourself working off your balance by serving your creditor. This form of slavery wasn't permanent. Once the debt was paid, the individual could be freed. But the laws surrounding debt slavery were strict, and the punishment for failing to pay could be severe. Some individuals found themselves working for years under difficult conditions to repay their debts, which raised questions about the fairness of the system. However, unlike other systems of slavery in ancient cultures, there was an interesting legal distinction in ancient Egypt. Slaves were not considered property in the same way they were in later civilizations. While slaves could be bought and sold, they were also considered to have legal standing with certain protections in place. For example, if a slave was mistreated by their owner, they could potentially seek legal action. There are even records of slaves suing their masters for mistreatment, which is a fascinating aspect of Egyptian law. This suggests that, while slaves were still considered subordinate to their masters, they had some legal rights that prevented them from being treated purely as property. Historians still argue about how widespread slavery was in ancient Egypt. Some believe that it was more common in earlier periods, particularly during times of military expansion, while others suggest that slavery was a relatively limited institution during much of Egypt's long history. While it's hard to determine exact numbers, evidence suggests that the majority of the population in Egypt wasn't enslaved. The majority of laborers, for example, worked as farmers, artisans, or traders, and many of them enjoyed certain legal protections. Slavery, when it existed, was more about fulfilling specific roles within society rather than forming the backbone of the economy. But let's not kid ourselves. Being a slave in ancient Egypt wasn't a comfortable life. Even if there were legal protections, these individuals still faced a much harsher reality than most free citizens. They worked long hours in harsh conditions, whether it was hauling stone blocks for the pyramids, tending to the fields, or working as household servants. Their lives were dictated by the whims of their masters, and they had limited opportunities to improve their status. What's even more interesting is the role of the Egyptian state in regulating slavery. Unlike many other societies, where slavery was a purely private matter, the Egyptian government had its own regulations regarding slaves. The pharaoh and his officials were often involved in managing the distribution of laborers, whether they were slaves, conscripted workers, or free men. This meant that the state had some say in how slavery was implemented and how workers were treated. Another curious aspect of slavery in ancient Egypt was the role of women in the system. Women could be enslaved just like men, but they also had unique legal protections. Female slaves, for example, could own property and even enter into contracts. If a woman was freed from slavery, she had the same legal rights as any other Egyptian woman, including the ability to own property, engage in trade, and inherit wealth. These protections for women were not universal in all ancient societies, and it's a testament to the relatively progressive nature of Egyptian law in regard to gender. Interestingly, there were even instances where slaves could rise to positions of power or wealth. Some slaves, especially those who worked in high-level administration or as personal servants to the pharaoh, were able to accumulate wealth and eventually buy their freedom. Once freed, they could often enter the ranks of Egyptian society as free citizens, though their status was still marked by their previous servitude. This ability for slaves to rise above their station was rare, but it speaks to the more flexible nature of Egyptian slavery compared to other systems throughout history. Historians still debate how many people in Egypt were enslaved and how widespread the practice truly was. Some scholars believe that slavery was largely concentrated in certain periods, such as during military expansions or in the time of the Great Pyramid builders. Others argue that slavery was a more common feature throughout Egyptian society, with slaves making up a significant portion of the labor force. However, what we do know is that the laws governing slavery were far from static. They evolved over time and reflected the changing needs of Egyptian society. While slavery in Egypt was far from a utopia, it was more complex and nuanced than we often give it credit for. Slaves had legal rights, and there were some protections in place to prevent them from being treated as mere property. The ability to sue for mistreatment or negotiate a release from servitude was unique to Egyptian law and suggests that, while Egypt was far from perfect, it had a legal system that recognized the humanity of those who were enslaved. As we consider the role of slavery in ancient Egypt, it's important to recognize that the legal system was multifaceted, with both harsh realities and surprising protections. Slaves were an integral part of Egyptian society, but they were also part of a legal framework that, in some ways, sought to provide them with more protections and opportunities than their counterparts in other ancient civilizations. It's a complicated history, but one that is crucial for understanding the full scope of Egyptian law and its impact on society. One of the most curious and often overlooked aspects of ancient Egyptian law is its treatment of animals. You might be wondering, what could possibly be so interesting about laws governing animals in a society known for its grand monuments and powerful pharaohs? Well, as it turns out, animals in ancient Egypt weren't just pets or mere creatures to be ignored. They were deeply intertwined with religious beliefs, societal norms, and, yes, the law. Egyptians believed that animals were not only essential to their daily lives but also played a crucial role in maintaining the cosmic order. In fact, some animals were so sacred that they were seen as representations of gods themselves. Cats, for example, were considered sacred, associated with the goddess Batet, who was revered as the protector of the home, fertility, and women. Killing a cat, whether intentionally or accidentally, was a serious offense, one that could lead to severe punishment, even death in some cases. The laws surrounding the treatment of animals in Egypt were both symbolic and practical, and they offer a fascinating glimpse into how the Egyptians viewed their relationship with the natural world. In the case of cats, the legal consequences of harm were severe because of their religious significance. Batet was not just a household deity, she was a protector of Egypt itself. So, an offense against a cat was not just an offense against the owner, it was seen as an offense against the goddess, and by extension, the pharaoh himself. If you killed a cat, you were disrupting the cosmic order, and this could have disastrous consequences. In fact, there are historical records that suggest that Egyptians were so protective of their cats that they would even go to great lengths to ensure their safety. Cats were given special protection under the law, and they were often mummified and buried with the same respect as humans. But the treatment of cats wasn't the only instance where animals were governed by strict laws. Egypt also had laws surrounding other creatures, such as crocodiles and hippos, that were equally fascinating and peculiar. These animals were sometimes held accountable for crimes, particularly when they were involved in accidents or attacks on humans. For example, if a crocodile attacked and killed a person, the law might require that the crocodile be captured and put to death. This wasn't just a form of retribution, it was a way of ensuring that balance was restored. Even the animals of Egypt were seen as part of the cosmic order, and their actions could disrupt it just as easily as the actions of humans. Historians still debate whether the laws governing animal behavior were enforced with the same rigor as those for humans. Some argue that the laws were more symbolic than practical, with the real enforcement coming in the form of religious rituals and symbolic punishment rather than physical retribution. For example, if a crocodile attacked a person, the pharaoh might order a religious ceremony to appease the gods, and the death of the animal might be seen as part of a larger divine justice. Others believe that the laws were taken quite seriously, with officials or priests overseeing the execution of animals who committed crimes. This raises an interesting point about the role of religion in the legal system. In ancient Egypt, law and religion were inseparable. If an animal harmed a human, it wasn't just a matter of human law, it was seen as a sign that the divine order had been disrupted. The same could be said for other creatures, like bulls, which were often used in sacrificial rituals. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of divine law, was expected to ensure that the actions of animals did not upset the balance of the world. Whether through religious ceremony or legal decree, animals were an integral part of the legal system in a way that's difficult to imagine in modern law. There were also laws surrounding the domestication of animals. For example, The Egyptians had strict regulations about how animals could be used in agricultural work, and they made sure that these animals were treated fairly. There were regulations in place to ensure that oxen and donkeys used for plowing weren't overworked or mistreated. If someone was caught abusing an animal, they could face legal consequences. These laws, while designed to protect the animals themselves, also served a practical purpose. They ensured that the animals would remain healthy and productive for the people who depended on them. It's fascinating to think about how the Egyptians managed this balance between protecting animals and using them as tools for their civilization. On one hand, animals were revered for their symbolic and religious significance, and their protection was integral to maintaining the harmony of the cosmos. On the other hand, they were also treated as resources to be utilized in daily life, from agriculture to transportation. The laws governing animals in Egypt weren't just about ensuring that animals were kept safe, they were about ensuring that the entire ecosystem, human and animal alike, was functioning in harmony with the divine order. So, whether it was a cat strolling through your home, a crocodile sunning itself on the riverbank, or a donkey pulling a cart, the laws of ancient Egypt took into account the role that animals played in maintaining balance. This holistic approach to law, where everything from humans to animals to the gods was interconnected, speaks to the deeply spiritual nature of the Egyptian legal system. It wasn't just about punishment or regulation, it was about restoring balance and keeping order in the world, a task that extended far beyond just the human realm. Historians still debate the level of reverence and protection that animals received under Egyptian law. Some suggest that the treatment of animals was a reflection of their religious significance, while others argue that the laws were more practical, aimed at maintaining agricultural productivity and social order. Regardless of how we interpret these laws today, one thing is clear: animals played a central role in the legal and cultural life of ancient Egypt, and the way they were treated reveals much about the Egyptians' view of the natural world. As we've seen in previous sections, the legal system in ancient Egypt was deeply intertwined with the concept of Ma'at, divine order, and this concept wasn't just about maintaining human laws. It extended to how society viewed justice, right and wrong, and even the dead. While we often think of Egyptian law as primarily concerned with the living, in reality, there were laws that specifically governed the dead and their possessions, laws that ensured that their journey into the afterlife was orderly and that their property was handled appropriately. The ancient Egyptians had an intricate belief in the afterlife. To them, death wasn't the end of existence, it was just the beginning of a new journey. This journey, however, wasn't an easy one. It was believed that the soul would face trials in the afterlife, most notably the judgment of the dead, in which the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was found to be too heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Ammit, the monstrous goddess. But if the heart was pure, the deceased would be granted eternal life. But what does all this have to do with law? The afterlife wasn't just a spiritual realm, it was heavily regulated by laws that governed how the deceased would be treated. For one thing, the Egyptians believed that a person's property didn't just vanish when they died. In fact, they had an entire legal framework for managing the possessions of the deceased. If someone passed away and left behind goods or land, the living had to follow strict rules about who would inherit what. These rules ensured that the deceased's wealth would be distributed in a fair and orderly manner, and they were often outlined in wills or spoken declarations made by the deceased before their death. But even after death, there were legal procedures in place to make sure everything was handled properly. If someone died without leaving an heir, the property could be claimed by the state, or it could be transferred to the pharaoh's coffers. This wasn't just a matter of property law, it was about ensuring that the cosmic order was preserved. The Egyptians believed that the dead had a role to play in the afterlife, and part of that role was to ensure that their earthly possessions were dealt with properly. If the dead were not respected, the living could risk angering the gods, which could upset the balance of Ma'at. What's especially fascinating is the way the Egyptians linked law and the afterlife. The dead were not just absent, they were actively involved in the legal and religious framework of society. If someone violated the property rights of the deceased, the punishment could be severe, as it was seen as an affront to both the dead and the gods. The living were expected to treat the dead with the same respect as the gods themselves, and that included following the laws governing inheritance and the treatment of burial sites. Historians still debate how strict these laws were and how frequently they were enforced. Some believe that the laws governing the dead were just as important as those governing the living. Others suggest that they were more symbolic, meant to preserve the sanctity of the afterlife rather than impose actual legal penalties. What is clear, however, is that death and its accompanying legalities were treated with the utmost seriousness by the Egyptians. In a society where the afterlife was as important as life itself, the legal treatment of the deceased ensured that their journey to the next world was as smooth as possible. One of the more intriguing aspects of Egyptian law regarding the dead was the treatment of tomb robbers. Tombs were seen as sacred spaces where the dead would rest for eternity. Robbing a tomb was considered not just a crime against the living, but a crime against the gods and the deceased themselves. The penalties for tomb robbing were severe, often resulting in death or lifelong servitude. The Egyptians took great care to protect the burial sites of the wealthy, and tombs were often sealed with complex traps and guards to deter thieves. While the laws surrounding the afterlife were strict, they also highlight the Egyptians' deep respect for the dead and their belief that death wasn't an end but a continuation of life in a different form. This concept of the afterlife, and the legal systems that surrounded it, speaks to a broader philosophy of justice and order that permeated every aspect of Egyptian society. Perhaps the most striking element of these laws is how they highlight the ancient Egyptians' understanding of balance. Maat wasn't just a principle that applied to the living, it extended beyond the grave. The Egyptians believed that even after death, individuals still had a responsibility to maintain order in the world. The laws governing death and the treatment of the deceased were a reflection of this belief. They weren't just laws for the living, they were laws that ensured the continued harmony of the universe, even in the afterlife. But what about the legal rights of the dead themselves? In ancient Egypt, it wasn't just about the property of the deceased, it was about their dignity. The deceased were believed to continue to play an active role in the spiritual landscape of the world. It wasn't uncommon for people to make offerings to the deceased or to perform rituals on their behalf, ensuring that they were well taken care of in the afterlife. These rituals weren't just religious, they had legal implications as well. If you failed to honor the deceased according to the laws, you risked offending the gods, which could lead to disastrous consequences. While the dead were legally protected, the living had a significant role in ensuring that they were treated with respect. The living were required to follow the laws surrounding inheritance, tomb preservation, and burial rites. This created a sense of continuity between life and death, where the actions of the living had direct consequences for the dead, and vice versa. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly practical or if they were more symbolic, meant to reinforce the cultural importance of the afterlife. Regardless of how they were enforced, the legal system surrounding the dead in ancient Egypt reveals just how deeply the afterlife was integrated into the very fabric of Egyptian law. Death wasn't something to be feared or avoided, it was simply another phase in the eternal cycle of life and death, and the law ensured that everything was in its proper place. One of the most striking features of ancient Egyptian law was its intersection with religion. The legal system wasn't just about keeping order in the kingdom, it was about maintaining Maat, or divine balance, in all aspects of life. The pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Maat, and it was his responsibility to ensure that the laws were in line with the God's will. But religion didn't just influence the big decisions. It permeated every level of society, even the most mundane aspects of daily life. Imagine waking up in ancient Egypt, where every action you took could be seen as an extension of divine order. Even the smallest of offenses, say, using the wrong measurement for grain or not paying proper homage to the gods, could disrupt the cosmic balance. This was where the priests and scribes came in. They were the enforcers of divine law, interpreting the will of the gods and ensuring that the pharaoh's edicts aligned with the sacred principles of Maat. They didn't just serve the gods, they were, in many ways, the law itself. One of the most unique aspects of Egyptian law was the way in which priests could influence legal decisions. They weren't just religious figures, they were also legal authorities. This blending of religion and law created a system where every legal dispute, from property rights to personal grievances, could ultimately be traced back to divine will. If you had a legal issue, it wasn't just about who owned what or who was at fault. It was about how the gods viewed the situation. Priests could interpret the law through a religious lens, which often meant that their decisions were seen as unchallengeable. After all, if the pharaoh was the living god and the priests were his earthly representatives, how could their decisions be questioned? But this wasn't just about abstract religious ideas. It had real consequences for people's lives. In ancient Egypt, religion and law weren't two separate spheres. They were part of the same system. If you broke the law, it wasn't just a violation of human society, it was a violation of the god's order. And that could have serious repercussions. For example, if someone were caught in a minor crime, say, lying about a contract or failing to fulfill an obligation, they might face fines or public humiliation. But if they were caught in a more serious crime, like theft or murder, they might be subjected to divine retribution. The gods, through their earthly representatives, ensured that balance was restored. Historians still debate the exact role of religion in Egyptian law. Some argue that religion was simply a tool used by the pharaoh and the priesthood to maintain control over the people. Others believe that the Egyptians genuinely saw their laws as divinely inspired, with a real belief that breaking the law was an affront to the gods themselves. Regardless of where you fall in that debate, one thing is clear: religion was not something separate from the law in Egypt, it was the foundation of it. One of the key symbols of this divine connection to the law was the famous scales of Ma'at. These scales were often depicted in Egyptian art, symbolizing the balance between truth and falsehood, good and evil, order and chaos. It wasn't just a metaphorical concept, it was a literal standard by which all actions were judged. The scales were used during the judgment of the dead, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at to determine their fate in the afterlife. This same concept of balance applied to the legal system as well. If someone violated the laws of Egypt, they were seen as disturbing this balance, and it was up to the pharaoh and his officials to restore it. The concept of Ma'at also influenced how crimes were perceived. For example, while theft might be seen as a personal offense in many societies, in Egypt, it was viewed as a crime against the gods, as it disrupted the cosmic order. In some cases, the punishment for theft was not just about making the victim whole, it was about ensuring that balance was restored. This was why punishments could be so severe. They weren't just about justice for the victim, they were about maintaining divine order. Interestingly, some legal scholars suggest that Egypt's laws were more concerned with the prevention of crime than the punishment of it. The Egyptians were obsessed with ensuring that everyone adhered to the proper rules and rituals, as this was seen as the only way to keep Ma'at intact. This meant that public officials, priests, and even the pharaoh himself had a responsibility to ensure that everyone was following the divine law. There were even laws in place that required public officials to regularly check up on the citizens they were responsible for, making sure that everything was in order. Another fascinating aspect of Egyptian law was its focus on truth. The Egyptians believed that truth was essential to maintaining Ma'at, and they had a special legal ritual designed to uncover the truth in disputes. This was called the trial of the gods, and it involved a formal investigation into the facts of a case, often with divine intervention. In some cases, priests would perform rituals to invoke the gods, asking them to reveal the truth of the matter. This idea of divine truth extended to all aspects of the law, from property disputes to murder cases. It wasn't just about finding the facts, it was about aligning those facts with divine will. One particularly interesting example of this was the legal procedures surrounding the weighing of the heart ceremony, which was also used to judge the innocence or guilt of the deceased in the afterlife. In a way, this ceremony was the ultimate metaphor for Egyptian law. It was about determining whether someone had lived in accordance with Ma'at and, by extension, whether they had followed the divine laws of Egypt. If the deceased's heart was lighter than the feather of Mot, they were deemed worthy to enter the afterlife. If it was heavier, they were punished for their misdeeds. This symbolism of the heart and feather became a powerful representation of Egypt's belief in justice and truth, with the gods themselves acting as the ultimate judges. Historians still argue about the practical application of these concepts. Were Egyptians truly concerned with the moral integrity of their citizens, or was the legal system simply a tool to maintain power and control? It's hard to say. But what's undeniable is that the Egyptian legal system was intricately tied to their religion, and the laws of Egypt were seen as sacred, enforced by divine will. The connection between law, religion, and Mot in ancient Egypt formed a legal framework that was both practical and deeply spiritual, a system that sought to maintain balance in every aspect of life. Trade was one of the driving forces behind ancient Egyptian society. From the bustling marketplaces of Thebes to the grand trade routes that spanned from the Nile to distant lands, Egypt was a hub of commerce. But in a society where laws and religion were intertwined, even trade had its own set of legal boundaries and expectations. The legal system governing trade wasn't just about contracts and disputes, it was about ensuring that all commercial activities were conducted in alignment with divine order. In ancient Egypt, the laws surrounding trade, from the use of weights and measures to the regulation of markets, were as important as the physical goods exchanged. Let's start with the basics. Trade in ancient Egypt wasn't just about buying and selling, it was about sustaining the balance of society. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of Mot, was responsible for ensuring that all trade was fair and just. And that meant regulating everything from the price of grain to the standards of weights and measures. It wasn't enough for merchants to just agree on prices or trade in good faith. There had to be a system of measurement that was standardized and consistent across the kingdom. This was essential for maintaining economic balance, ensuring that the proper amount of goods was exchanged and that no one was cheated in the process. Imagine you're an Egyptian merchant in one of the grand marketplaces. You're dealing in grain, copper, and linen, and you're trading with people from distant lands like Punt or Mesopotamia. You can't just trust the other party to use their own measurements, there has to be a standard. And that's where the legal system comes in. There were specific regulations about how goods should be measured, and the government took these rules very seriously. If a merchant was caught using false weights, they could face penalties. This wasn't just about enforcing fairness in business, it was about ensuring that the cosmic balance of the economy was preserved. Historians still debate how strictly these laws were enforced. Some argue that the laws were rigid and that merchants had little room to maneuver. Others suggest that there was more flexibility, particularly for those with close ties to the ruling elite. However, one thing is clear: the regulation of trade in ancient Egypt was far more sophisticated than we often give it credit for. Merchants were not only required to follow the laws of weights and measures, they were also expected to respect religious guidelines that governed their business activities. One particularly interesting feature of trade law in Egypt was the way it connected commerce to religious practices. Many commercial transactions were conducted under the watchful eyes of the priests. Trade was seen as not just an economic activity but a sacred duty. Transactions were often blessed by priests, and religious rituals were performed to ensure the success of trade expeditions. This was particularly important for international trade, as Egypt had to ensure that its dealings with foreign powers aligned with divine will. If a trade mission to a distant land was successful, it was seen as a sign of divine favor. If it failed, it was often interpreted as a sign that the gods were displeased. The importance of religion in trade extended to the way Egypt conducted its interactions with foreign nations. For example, Egyptian traders who ventured to lands like Punt or the Levant had to navigate not just political and economic systems but religious ones. The pharaoh often sent offerings to foreign gods to ensure the success of trade expeditions. These offerings weren't just symbolic. They were part of a larger legal framework that tied Egypt's commercial ventures to divine approval. In this sense, trade wasn't just about material goods. It was about ensuring that Egypt's relationship with the gods and with foreign lands remained in harmony. And let's not forget the role of the scribes. In ancient Egypt, scribes were responsible for keeping detailed records of commercial transactions. They weren't just clerks, they were vital to ensuring that trade laws were followed. Every transaction, from the sale of a small pottery jar to the acquisition of exotic goods from faraway lands, was recorded. These records helped ensure that disputes could be resolved and that the laws governing trade were being adhered to. Scribes also played a key role in enforcing the laws of weights and measures, ensuring that both merchants and customers were held accountable. The legal framework surrounding trade also extended to the regulation of market activities. In some cases, the government would control prices to prevent inflation or manipulation by merchants. There were even laws about what types of goods could be sold in specific areas. Certain goods, such as grain and sacred items, had to be sold in approved locations to ensure that they were distributed properly. The government even had a hand in determining how the proceeds from these sales were used. It wasn't uncommon for a portion of the profits from key markets to be funneled into religious or state-run projects, further demonstrating how the legal and economic systems were intertwined. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egypt's trade laws was the role of international treaties. When Egypt engaged in trade with foreign nations, it often involved the signing of treaties, which were treated like sacred agreements. These treaties weren't just diplomatic, they were seen as binding under the laws of both Egypt and the other nation involved. If one party broke the treaty or failed to honor the terms of trade, they could be subject to divine retribution. This wasn't just about politics, it was about maintaining Maat and ensuring that Egypt's dealings with foreign powers were in alignment with cosmic law. Historians still argue over how formalized these trade treaties were and how strictly they were enforced. Some suggest that they were mostly symbolic, meant to reinforce Egypt's image as a powerful and divinely favored kingdom. Others believe that these treaties were central to Egypt's trade policies and were enforced with great seriousness. Regardless of the specifics, what's clear is that trade in ancient Egypt was far more complex than we often imagine. It wasn't just about exchanging goods, it was about maintaining divine order and ensuring that Egypt's relationship with the world and the gods remained intact. Ultimately, the laws surrounding trade in Egypt were about more than just economics. They were about ensuring that everything from the smallest transaction to the largest international agreement was carried out in alignment with the divine order. The role of the pharaoh, the priests, and the scribes was to ensure that trade didn't disrupt the delicate balance of society, keeping Egypt's economy and its relationship with the gods harmonious. Whether you were buying bread from a market stall or leading a trade mission across the seas, the laws that governed your actions were part of a larger system designed to ensure that Maat was preserved at all costs. The role of gods in ancient Egyptian law is one of the most fascinating elements of their legal system. Law in Egypt wasn't simply a set of rules made by humans, it was divinely inspired, with every decision, from the mundane to the monumental, tied to the will of the gods. The pharaoh, as the living embodiment of divine order, was responsible for maintaining Maat, the principle of cosmic balance, through law. But it wasn't just the pharaoh who wielded divine influence over the law. The gods themselves played an active role in legal decisions. One of the most significant ways the gods were involved in the law was through divine justice. The concept of justice in Egypt was not simply about human fairness, it was about maintaining the divine order of the universe. Laws were seen as the embodiment of Maat, which represented the harmony of the cosmos. If someone broke the law, they weren't just violating a social contract, they were disrupting the very fabric of the universe. This is why punishments were often so severe, as they were not only meant to correct human behavior but also to restore balance to the universe. Take, for example, the role of the goddess Maat herself. She was the personification of truth, justice, and order, and her feather was used in the judgment of the dead to weigh the heart of the deceased against her feather. If the heart was found to be lighter than the feather, the deceased was considered just and worthy of eternal life. But if it was heavier, The individual was punished by being devoured by the monster Amit. This judgment wasn't just symbolic, it was a reflection of the legal system in the living world. Just as the gods ensured the deceased were judged fairly, it was the responsibility of the pharaoh and priests to ensure that justice was served in the living world according to divine will. The gods were seen as the ultimate arbiters of justice, and their influence was felt in every legal decision, no matter how small. Historians still debate the degree to which divine intervention played a role in the legal system. Some argue that the laws were a blend of practical governance and religious belief, while others suggest that the pharaoh's authority was seen as directly derived from the gods, meaning that the pharaoh's word was effectively the will of the gods themselves. One thing is certain, though: in Egypt, law was never just a human creation. It was an extension of divine will, and the gods were intimately involved in every legal decision. Let's consider the role of the gods in legal disputes. If you had a problem with a neighbor, a business partner, or a family member, the pharaoh or his appointed judges could help resolve the issue. But this wasn't a mere legal formality. It was believed that the gods were present in these decisions, guiding the judges to ensure that divine justice prevailed. There's even evidence of trials where the gods were explicitly called upon to help make decisions. For example, if a person was accused of stealing, they might swear an oath in the name of a god, calling upon the divine to prove their innocence or guilt. This oath was taken seriously, as it was believed that if someone lied while invoking the gods, they would face divine retribution. The gods were not only seen as witnesses to human actions, but they were also believed to intervene when justice was not served. This divine involvement in legal matters extended to punishments as well. If someone was found guilty of a crime, the punishment wasn't just about retribution, it was about restoring cosmic balance. The gods were thought to be involved in the execution of punishments, whether that meant the physical punishment of the offender or the metaphysical restoration of order. The legal system, therefore, was not just about correcting individual wrongs, it was about maintaining harmony within society and the universe. If someone was punished, it was because their actions had disrupted that balance, and it was up to the pharaoh and his priests to ensure that the offender faced the appropriate consequences in alignment with divine law. The gods were also involved in the legal process through the priests. Priests weren't just religious figures, they were legal authorities too. They had the power to interpret the law and make decisions, and their authority was derived directly from their connection to the divine. The pharaoh, as the earthly representative of the gods, would often rely on priests to enforce legal decisions. These priests were responsible for ensuring that the law was applied in a way that honored the gods. In some cases, they even served as judges in legal disputes, making decisions based on religious principles. This blending of religious and legal authority made the priesthood a key player in Egypt's legal system. One example of this divine influence in legal matters was the role of the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and judgment. Thoth was often invoked in legal disputes, particularly in matters involving contracts or agreements. If two parties had a disagreement over a contract, they might turn to Thoth for guidance. Thoth was seen as the ultimate arbiter of truth and fairness, and his involvement in legal matters ensured that justice was upheld. He was also believed to be a mediator between the gods and humans, helping to ensure that divine will was respected in legal decisions. Historians still debate how much of the legal system was truly driven by divine influence. Some argue that the gods were more symbolic, acting as a form of legitimacy for the pharaoh's authority. Others believe that the gods were seen as actively involved in every legal decision, ensuring that justice was always in line with divine will. What is clear, however, is that the gods played a fundamental role in shaping Egypt's legal system. Every legal decision, from the most mundane to the most profound, was viewed through the lens of divine order. The integration of religion and law in Egypt speaks to the deep connection between the gods and the everyday lives of the people. In ancient Egypt, there was no separation between religious and legal matters. Both were seen as part of the same system that ensured balance, harmony, and justice in the world. The gods weren't distant deities, they were active participants in human affairs, ensuring that justice was served and that Ma'at was maintained. This divine approach to law wasn't unique to Egypt. Many ancient civilizations saw their laws as divinely inspired, but Egypt's system was particularly intertwined with religion. The pharaoh, priests, and gods themselves all played key roles in maintaining the legal system, ensuring that it was just, fair, and in alignment with divine will. Whether it was the gods acting as arbiters in a legal dispute or the pharaoh ensuring that Ma'at was preserved, the influence of the divine was central to Egypt's legal framework. And for the ancient Egyptians, law wasn't just a human institution, it was a reflection of the will of the gods themselves. In ancient Egypt, animals were not only revered as sacred beings but also held accountable under the law, an idea that may seem bizarre by today's standards but was deeply embedded in the culture and legal framework of the time. While many animals were seen as symbols of gods, such as the cat associated with Batet or the falcon representing Horus, their behavior also came under scrutiny when it affected human lives. Surprisingly, the laws surrounding animals in Egypt were not just about protecting these sacred creatures, but also about ensuring that cosmic order, Ma'at, was preserved in the animal kingdom, just as it was among humans. Let's take a closer look at some of the more peculiar laws concerning animals. For instance, the ancient Egyptians took very seriously the matter of livestock, particularly those used in agriculture and transportation. If someone's ox or donkey caused damage, say, by trampling a neighbor's garden, the owner was legally responsible for paying restitution. The law didn't just extend to the livestock itself but held the owner accountable, ensuring that people took responsibility for their animals' actions. But things got even more peculiar when it came to certain wild animals. In some instances, crocodiles, which were both feared and revered, could be brought to trial, of sorts, if they killed someone. This wasn't just about punishing the animal, it was about restoring balance. The belief was that animals, especially dangerous ones, could disrupt the harmony of human life if they attacked or killed humans. Therefore, there are records suggesting that the pharaoh might order a crocodile to be captured and, in some cases, killed to prevent any further transgressions. In this sense, it wasn't just a human-centered legal system, it was one that also considered the actions of animals and how they affected the cosmic balance. The Egyptians' view of animals was deeply influenced by their religious beliefs. Many animals, like cats, were seen as intermediaries between humans and the divine, often playing roles in religious ceremonies or serving as sacred symbols. Killing a cat, for example, was considered a grave offense, and the punishment could be severe. But these laws were not just symbolic, they were practical as well. There were strict penalties for harming sacred animals, as it was believed that disrupting the sacred balance would anger the gods. If someone were to harm a sacred animal like a cat or a bull, they could be subjected to divine punishment, which might include exile or even death. But how serious were these laws? Historians still argue whether they were rigorously enforced or if they were more symbolic in nature. Some scholars believe that while the laws were strict in theory, they weren't always enforced as harshly in practice. Others suggest that the laws governing animals were taken very seriously, with offenders facing severe consequences. Regardless of how strictly these laws were enforced, one thing is clear: animals were not just passive members of Egyptian society, they were an integral part of the legal and religious fabric of the kingdom. There's also evidence to suggest that certain animals, especially those that were domesticated or integral to Egyptian society, had their own set of legal protections. For example, laws were in place to prevent the mistreatment of animals used in agriculture. Oxen, which were vital for plowing and transport, had to be treated with care, and there were legal protections in place to ensure that they were well fed and not overworked. If an ox was abused or overworked, the owner could be held responsible and might face legal repercussions. This was another example of how Egyptian law connected the treatment of animals to the preservation of Ma'at, ensuring that all aspects of life, human and animal alike, contributed to the balance of the world. Furthermore, the pharaoh and the elite were not exempt from these animal laws. If the pharaoh's hunting dogs were found to be mistreated or if the royal falcons were not properly cared for, these offenses could be brought to court. In the eyes of the law, even the most revered members of society had a duty to respect and care for animals, as the well-being of animals was considered essential to maintaining order in the kingdom. If the rulers themselves were caught violating the law regarding animals, it would not only be a personal failing, it would be seen as a threat to the divine order they were meant to uphold. Even in the case of the sacred bull, Apis, which was revered as a living god, the law ensured that the animal was treated with the highest respect. The bull was not just a symbol of divine power but also played a central role in religious rituals. If the Apis bull died, elaborate mourning rituals were performed, and legal measures were taken to preserve the sanctity of the animal's death. The body of the bull would be embalmed and placed in a tomb, and any person or group found desecrating its body would face harsh punishment. The legal significance of the Apis bull demonstrates how sacred animals were legally protected and how the laws extended to their treatment, ensuring that even their death and burial were conducted in accordance with divine law. This intertwining of law, religion, and animals in ancient Egypt illustrates the deep connection the Egyptians had with the natural world. The animals weren't just seen as living beings, they were part of a cosmic order, and their behavior had consequences that extended beyond the physical world. In many ways, animals were viewed as both sacred and regulated, with laws designed to ensure their proper treatment and to maintain the balance of society and the universe. Whether it was a domestic animal, a sacred bull, or a fearsome crocodile, the legal system in ancient Egypt recognized that every living being had a role to play in the divine order. As bizarre as it may seem to us today, the legal system that governed the actions of animals in Egypt was a reflection of their worldview, a worldview where everything, human or animal, was connected through the divine balance of Ma'at. It wasn't just about enforcing fairness. It was about ensuring that the cosmos remained in harmony. Whether it was the pharaoh's decree, a priest's judgment, or the judgment of the gods, the law in ancient Egypt was a living, breathing system that encompassed everything from the tiniest insect to the most majestic lion, and ensured that all contributed to the maintenance of order in the world. As we've explored so far, ancient Egyptian law was a complex, multifaceted system that touched every aspect of life, from the treatment of animals to trade and justice. But what about the role of scribes and record-keeping? In ancient Egypt, scribes were not just functionaries, they were the backbone of the legal and bureaucratic system. Without scribes, the very concept of law and order as the Egyptians understood it might not have existed. They played an essential role in making sure that Egypt's legal framework was not just a set of oral traditions but a highly organized system backed by written records. Imagine for a moment the bustling streets of Thebes or Memphis, where the sound of scribes writing in ink on papyrus was a constant backdrop. Scribes, who were trained in the art of writing and reading hieroglyphs, were among the most educated people in ancient Egypt. They were crucial in documenting everything from legal contracts to land transactions to official decrees issued by the pharaoh. In fact, many of the legal documents we have today that tell us about ancient Egyptian law were written by these scribes. Without their meticulous record-keeping, we would have little understanding of how Egyptian law worked on a day-to-day basis. One of the key roles of the scribes was to ensure that the laws and decrees issued by the pharaoh were not only communicated but also recorded for future reference. This wasn't just about writing things down, it was about ensuring that the law was consistently applied and that there was a clear record of all transactions. From the largest legal cases involving the pharaoh to the most mundane disputes over property, scribes were tasked with documenting every legal matter in painstaking detail. They were the living memory of the kingdom, keeping track of everything that happened in the legal system and ensuring that records were maintained for future generations. In some cases, scribes acted as the actual administrators of justice. They often worked closely with judges, advising on legal matters and helping to interpret laws based on written records. Since Egypt's legal system was deeply tied to the concept of divine order, the scribes' role was not just bureaucratic, they were seen as facilitators of divine justice. The idea was that, by recording the law, scribes were helping to preserve Ma'at, the cosmic balance, by ensuring that legal decisions were consistent and fair. Historians still debate how much influence scribes had over legal decisions. Some scholars argue that they were purely clerical workers with no real power, while others suggest that they played a more significant role, especially in ensuring that legal processes were carried out correctly and that the law was applied consistently. It's likely that their influence varied depending on their rank and position. High-ranking scribes who worked for the pharaoh would have had more influence than those working in local courts. Nevertheless, the existence of a written legal system in Egypt made it one of the most advanced civilizations in terms of governance. While other ancient cultures relied on oral traditions or basic written records, the Egyptians had a sophisticated system of documentation that helped ensure the longevity and stability of their legal system. In addition to recording legal documents, scribes were also tasked with writing contracts, land deeds, and even personal letters. These documents were vital for regulating daily life and were used to settle disputes over property, inheritance, and trade. If you were involved in a legal dispute, a scribe would be the person you turned to for ensuring that your agreement or contract was legally binding. These contracts often outline terms in minute detail, including penalties for breaking the terms of the agreement. For example, if you were a merchant entering into a trade deal, a scribe would help you draft the terms of the contract, ensuring that both parties were bound by the law and that the transaction was considered legitimate in the eyes of the pharaoh and the gods. The legal documents that scribes created were not just functional, they were also imbued with religious significance. In many cases, scribes invoked the gods when drafting contracts or agreements, ensuring that the gods would witness and protect the transaction. This belief in divine oversight added a layer of sanctity to legal agreements that we don't typically see in modern systems. The scribes didn't just record transactions, they were acting as intermediaries between the divine and the human worlds. The gods, through the scribe's pen, were ensuring that the laws of Egypt were upheld and that Ma'at was preserved. Of course, the life of a scribe wasn't always easy. While they were highly respected and often enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle compared to other workers, they also had immense responsibility. If a scribe made a mistake in a legal document, if they misspelled a name or misinterpreted a law, it could have serious consequences. A simple error could lead to a case being dismissed or, in some cases, punishments for the scribe themselves. The accuracy and integrity of a scribe's work were taken very seriously, and the penalties for making mistakes could be severe. This pressure to maintain perfection meant that scribes were some of the most highly trained individuals in Egyptian society. Interestingly, the role of scribes extended beyond the written legal system. They were also involved in the administration of Egypt's vast bureaucracy, which managed everything from tax collection to land distribution. As Egypt was an agrarian society, the management of agricultural land was a central aspect of the legal system. Scribes played a key role in recording the ownership and distribution of land, ensuring that taxes were paid and that the pharaoh's decrees were followed. Their work kept the kingdom running smoothly, and it allowed the pharaoh to maintain control over one of the most sophisticated and organized civilizations in history. One fascinating feature of the Egyptian legal system, as facilitated by scribes, was the system of legal codes and precedents. Like modern legal systems, the Egyptians often referred to past cases to help guide their decisions in new cases. By keeping detailed records of legal decisions, scribes created a body of legal precedents that could be consulted when new cases arose. This system allowed the legal system to evolve and adapt over time, much like modern judicial systems do. Historians often wonder about the full scope of the scribes' influence in Egyptian law. Some suggest that scribes had considerable power in interpreting the law, given their education and proximity to the ruling elite. Others argue that they were merely recording the decisions of judges and the pharaoh, with little ability to shape the legal process themselves. What's clear, however, is that without the work of scribes, Egypt's legal system would not have been as effective or as enduring as it was. The scribes' meticulous record-keeping helped ensure that Egypt's laws were respected, enforced, and passed down through the generations. In ancient Egypt, the legal system was not just about enforcing laws. It was about maintaining balance, or mat, in society. But how did these laws extend to daily life, especially when it came to matters like property ownership, inheritance, and personal disputes? The Egyptians had a highly developed legal framework that governed everything from the smallest commercial transaction to the most important familial matters, ensuring that the order of society remained intact. Let's take a look at one of the most crucial aspects of Egyptian law: property ownership. In ancient societies, ownership of land and goods was often a tenuous concept, with rulers claiming the right to take land from subjects whenever they saw fit. But in Egypt, the system was more organized, with laws that provided protections for landowners. If someone owned land, it was their right to pass it on to their heirs, or even sell it without fear of arbitrary seizure, at least in theory. The concept of inheritance was crucial to the Egyptian legal system. Just as we have wills today to determine what happens to a person's property after they die, the Egyptians also had a system for managing inheritance. While not everyone could afford to leave a written will, there was still a sense that property would go to the family. The eldest son was often seen as the rightful heir, and it was customary for a man to pass down his wealth to his children. But it wasn't just the right of the living to inherit property, it was also a way of ensuring that divine order continued even after death. The Egyptians believed that one's connection to their family, particularly their descendants, was vital for maintaining their place in society and in the afterlife. In many ways, the inheritance laws reflected this belief. If someone passed away without an heir, their property was often claimed by the state or the pharaoh, which meant that the king ultimately had control over the legacy of his subjects. This centralization of property rights was a way to maintain control and ensure that no one individual accumulated too much power. But while the pharaoh held ultimate authority over the land, the legal system allowed for a level of personal autonomy when it came to property management and inheritance. It's interesting to note that while property laws were generally strict and well-regulated, the Egyptians had some flexibility in how they handled disputes. For example, if a family member contested the inheritance, they could take the matter to a court of law. Judges, often appointed by the pharaoh, would listen to both sides of the dispute and issue a ruling based on the law. These judges were often priests or scribes, people who had been trained in the intricacies of Egyptian law. Their job was not just to uphold the law but to ensure that divine order, mat, was maintained. However, inheritance wasn't always a straightforward process. Egyptian law also governed marriage, and marriage played a significant role in inheritance laws. A woman, for example, could inherit land or goods from her father or husband. But this wasn't always guaranteed, as the rights of women were still somewhat limited, particularly in terms of property ownership. While women could own property and engage in commerce, their rights were often subject to the whims of their male relatives or husbands. In some cases, inheritance was tied to the gender of the heirs. Sons were usually favored over daughters, particularly in matters of land inheritance. Historians still debate how much these inheritance laws were enforced or whether they were simply idealized in legal texts. Some believe that the system was largely theoretical and that the actual distribution of inheritance could vary depending on the social status of the deceased or the wealth of their family. Others argue that the legal protections for inheritance were vital in maintaining the order and stability of Egyptian society, ensuring that wealth was passed down in a structured and orderly way. Beyond inheritance, another key area of the legal system was the regulation of personal disputes. Whether it was a disagreement over a contract, a family argument, or a business deal, Egyptians had a system in place for resolving disputes. This system was based on mediation and arbitration, with judges playing a key role in ensuring that justice was done. The pharaoh, as the ultimate judge, would occasionally intervene in the most serious of cases, but for the most part, disputes were handled by local courts. One notable aspect of these personal disputes was the role of contracts. Egyptians had a highly developed system of contracts, which were essential for ensuring that agreements were upheld. Whether it was a land lease, a marriage contract, or a business deal, written agreements played a critical role in maintaining order. Contracts were often drawn up by scribes, who would ensure that the terms were clear and legally binding. In the event of a dispute, these written contracts would serve as evidence in court. This system of contracts was one of the earliest examples of written legal agreements, and it played a crucial role in ensuring that Egypt's legal system functioned smoothly. One fascinating example of Egyptian legal contracts was the marriage contract. Marriage was an essential institution in ancient Egypt, and the law surrounding marriage was just as structured as the laws governing property and inheritance. A marriage contract would outline the terms of the marriage, including the responsibilities of both parties, the dowry, and how property would be divided in the event of a divorce. The marriage contract was a legally binding document, and it ensured that both parties had clear expectations about their roles in the marriage. If a marriage ended in divorce, the contract was used to settle any disputes over property or wealth. It was a system that provided a level of fairness and order in what could be a contentious situation. While divorce was relatively common in ancient Egypt, it was still a legal matter that required documentation and regulation. A woman could initiate a divorce if she was dissatisfied with her marriage, and there were laws in place to protect her property rights in the event of a divorce. The Egyptians took divorce seriously, as it was considered a disruption to the natural order of the family. As a result, the legal system had provisions in place to ensure that both parties were treated fairly, and that any disputes over property or inheritance were resolved according to the law. Historians still wonder how closely these laws were adhered to in practice. Were marriages truly governed by these contracts, or were they more symbolic? Some believe that the marriage contract was a reflection of the importance placed on family life and inheritance in Egyptian society, while others argue that it was largely a formality, with the real power lying in the hands of the pharaoh and the priesthood. Regardless of the nuances, the fact that marriage and property laws were so highly regulated speaks to the importance of structure and stability in Egyptian society. The legacy of ancient Egyptian law is both fascinating and enduring. While the kingdom itself fell over 2 millennia ago, the principles underlying its legal system, regulation, order, and balance, continue to influence modern legal thinking, even if indirectly. As we've explored throughout this journey, the Egyptians' deep belief in the maintenance of Ma'at, their divine sense of justice, and their early innovations in record-keeping shaped not only their civilization but also set the groundwork for future legal systems across the world. But let's take a moment to reflect on what truly made Egyptian law unique and how its influence echoes through time. First, the concept of Ma'at, as we've seen, wasn't just a philosophical notion, it was the very framework of Egyptian life. Whether it was criminal law, property law, or laws regulating trade, everything came back to the preservation of divine order. Laws were viewed not merely as tools for human governance but as divine mandates, with every regulation reflecting the cosmic balance that the gods had established. If a person violated the law, it wasn't just a violation of human rights, it was a violation of the divine order itself. This mindset established a culture where legal frameworks were revered, not just enforced, which set ancient Egypt apart from many other civilizations. The pharaoh, as both the political and divine ruler, ensured that Ma'at was maintained through the legal system. His word was law, not just in the earthly realm but as a manifestation of divine will. The intertwining of religion and law in Egypt gave the system a moral authority that many ancient cultures lacked, and it reinforced the belief that justice was divinely inspired and enforced. In this way, the pharaoh was not simply a ruler but a guardian of cosmic order, responsible for maintaining balance in every facet of Egyptian life. This sense of responsibility also shaped Egypt's legal processes, making them more nuanced and based on principles of fairness rather than simple power. But the laws of Egypt were not just about big picture, cosmic balance. They also had a very practical side. As we saw in the cases of trade, contracts, and property laws, The Egyptians had a remarkably sophisticated system for handling everyday disputes. Their detailed record-keeping and written contracts were far ahead of their time, helping to regulate economic activities and ensure that property rights were respected. This approach to commerce helped Egypt remain one of the wealthiest and most stable civilizations for thousands of years. Their use of contracts and legal documentation laid the groundwork for modern legal practices, particularly in terms of property law and dispute resolution. One of the most enduring contributions of ancient Egyptian law was its system of inheritance. The idea that property could be passed on according to a structured and documented system of laws, where heirs could claim their inheritance based on clear legal grounds, was revolutionary. The right to inherit land and wealth was closely regulated, with laws that ensured fairness, even in cases of dispute. These concepts of inheritance and family rights were crucial in shaping later legal traditions around property ownership and familial inheritance, making the Egyptian system an early model for future civilizations. Perhaps one of the most unexpected features of Egyptian law was its treatment of women. While women's legal rights were still limited in many respects, ancient Egypt stood out for allowing women to own property, divorce, and even engage in business transactions independently. This level of legal autonomy for women was rare in the ancient world and has often been overshadowed by the patriarchal systems of law in other cultures. The Egyptians recognized that women, particularly in high-status roles, could contribute to the legal and social structure, and this acceptance laid a foundation for future progress in women's rights. The relationship between law and religion in ancient Egypt also speaks volumes about their view of justice. Divine law was, in many ways, inseparable from human law. Whether the issue at hand was a commercial dispute, a crime, or a matter of family inheritance, it was understood that the gods had an active hand in ensuring justice. Whether it was through the priests who mediated disputes or the divine judgment of the pharaoh, the law was seen as not just a human construct but a reflection of divine order. This close connection between religion and law, while unique to Egypt, served as a model for later systems of law that also intertwined religious and legal principles. While much of the legal system in Egypt focused on maintaining stability and order, it also addressed the nuances of daily life in ways that many other ancient cultures didn't. For example, the laws surrounding the treatment of animals were as detailed and comprehensive as those for humans. Sacred animals were given special protections, with punishments for those who harmed them. These laws reflected the Egyptians' deeply held belief in the interconnectedness of all things, both human and animal, within the framework of Ma'at. The legal system didn't just extend to human interactions. It ensured that even the natural world was governed by the same divine principles. The Egyptians also had a remarkably advanced system for regulating trade and commerce, as evidenced by their use of written contracts, standardized weights and measures, and detailed records of transactions. This system wasn't just about ensuring that merchants didn't cheat each other, it was about maintaining cosmic order. Trade was seen as a form of divine exchange, and it was essential that it was conducted fairly and justly, ensuring that the gods were pleased. The meticulous documentation of transactions by scribes and their role in administering justice were crucial in ensuring that Egypt's economy remained stable and prosperous. The influence of Egyptian law, though not as direct as other legal systems, has had a profound impact on the way we understand law and justice today. The principles of maintaining order, ensuring fairness in commerce, and protecting the rights of the deceased all laid the foundation for modern legal systems, particularly in terms of property rights, inheritance laws, and the concept of divine justice. Egypt's unique approach to law, where everything from personal disputes to the treatment of animals was seen through the lens of cosmic balance, offers a glimpse into a society that viewed law not as a human invention but as an extension of divine will. As we close this journey through the laws of ancient Egypt, one thing is clear: their legal system was more than just a set of rules. It was a way of life. It was a system designed to ensure that everything, from the smallest transaction to the most sacred act, was aligned with the divine order. The legacy of Egyptian law, with its focus on Ma'at, its emphasis on fairness, and its integration of religion and governance, continues to influence the way we think about justice and law today.